Come to order. This hearing is fully virtual, and we must once again address some housekeeping issues. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may unmute participants' microphones when will mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate this approval by nodding, the staff will unmute your microphone. I remember all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock applies. If there's a technology issue, we will move to the next member until this issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. And Mr. Calvert, to the committee members, when we get to questions, I'm going to ask for your indulgence. We had a member who had their screen on the whole time. And then when it was that individual's time to ask a question, there was a total failure of the system virtually and audioly to let that person participate. So I want to do something special for them today, but I'll get to that with questions, just to put you on notice. You'll notice a clock on your screen that will show you how much time is remaining. 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn yellow. 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time has almost expired. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red, and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of speaking order, we will follow the order set forward in the rules of the House, beginning with the chair and the ranking member. Members present at the time of when the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of their seniority. And finally, members not present at the time of the hearing when it's called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything that they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided to your staff. So with that, we'll begin the hearing. The Subcommittee on Defense is in order, and this afternoon the committee will receive testimony on the posture of the United States Army. Our two witnesses are the Honorable John E. Whitley, Acting Secretary of the Army, and General James McConsville of the Chief of Staff of the Army. Both witnesses have long and distinguished careers. Secretary Whitley, this is your first time testifying before the committee. The General has testified before the committee before. We welcome both of you to be with us today. And while we enjoy the strong working relationship we have with both of you, I would be remiss if I didn't commend President Biden for his recent nomination of Christine Worthmorth to be the first female Secretary of the Army. It's long overdue, and we welcome the opportunity to work with Ms. Worthmorth. Gentlemen, your message to the public is, and I quote, "People first." Now more than ever, we need to ensure that the health and welfare of our soldiers and their families is truly a #1 priority. We have soldiers deployed in 140 countries around the world, and our Army National Guard has been called upon to execute unprecedented numbers of missions. The committee expects continued investment in the health and safety and wellness of our soldiers and their families. This includes that Army leadership is being proactive in eliminating instances of sexual assault, harassment, and ideological extremism in the ranks. I'm also concerned about the constant pace of the Army National Guard deployments. Our Guardsmen and women are currently engaged in missions addressing issues such as civil disobedience, the Capitol complex security, southern border missions, and overseas operations. I am concerned about deployment fatigue, what it does to the morale of our soldiers, and how you are addressing retention issues as a result of that. I look forward to hearing how your requests for resources are going to attack these issues. Simultaneously, the Army is embarking upon a modernization effort, the likes of which we have not seen over the past 4 decades. Initiative requires significant investments in research and development to be successful. And I think you'll agree that this committee has been very supportive of your past efforts. We've also supported the Army's Future Command as a way for the Army to consolidate its modernization strategy under one roof. And I look forward to your honest assessment of how your newest command is performing. While we have not yet received the fiscal 2022 budget request, I hope we can discuss the priorities in the coming year. I'm particularly interested in your continued night court process that reviews legacy programs to identify duplication and access in order to fund higher priority programs. It's vitally important that all the services continue to perform budgetary review process to ensure appropriate funds is invested wisely. And I think everyone in this subcommittee would like to hear more about the quote-unquote night court and your definition of it. We want to continue to be a partner in executing the National Defense Strategy, but we need a high level of fidelity in your proposals to reduce or eliminate certain programs in order to fund higher risk R&D efforts. Given the benefits of your modernization pursuits, including working with small businesses in the public sector, I want to be sure that we give every opportunity to understand how your acquisition approach works. We understand that this is a challenging time for the Army, your soldiers, and their families. And this committee is responsible to provide you with a sufficient level of resources to support readiness, improve facilities, and modernize the force. But to be clear, this committee is an equal partner with the President in achieving our national security goals. And it is our responsibility to achieve those goals efficiently for the taxpayers, as well as conduct oversight programs that we fund. Fiscal year 2022 could be a challenging year for the Army, and I'd like to hear how you're prioritizing the programs across the Army. With that, I thank you, gentlemen, for appearing before the committee today to discuss and address these important issues. We will ask you to present your summarized statements in a moment, but first, I would like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Calvert, for his opening remarks. Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Acting Secretary John Whitley, General McConville, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to meet with us virtually today. Normally, this hearing would be an opportunity, as you know, to review the Army's funding needs. This is, after all, a budget hearing. But unfortunately, to quote my good friend Adam Smith, the Biden administration has been dragging their feet. So we don't have a budget to review. So this delay is very concerning to me. I know it is to the chair, and it increases the risk of a continuing resolution that nobody would like to have. What we do know about the defense budget is that the president has proposed I believe, an irresponsible top line, one that doesn't even keep up with inflation. Last year, Secretary McCarthy warned that without a net 3 to 5% funding growth in 2022, which was the line in which General Mattis had laid out for the National Defense Strategy, the Army would face difficult choices as it balanced current demands with modernization. Clearly, those difficult choices are now upon us. So I'll be interested in hearing how you plan to address them. I'd also like to hear more about the Army's new multi-domain operations construct and how it supports the joint force. Given the woefully inadequate defense funding proposed by the President, it will be critical that we literally get the biggest bang for the buck across the services. This means focusing on each service's core competencies and avoiding duplication of effort. Finally, there's the issue of the size of the Army. General McConville, you are on record stating that the Army needs to be larger, but you don't have the resources to fund it. So it will be helpful for us to understand the risks associated with the current size of the force and the potential shrinking of the Army. Thank you again for joining us, gentlemen. Thank you for both of you for your service, and I look forward to your testimony. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you so much. And we do not have the full committee chair ranking member with us, so we'll go right into testimony. Secretary Whitley, thank you. General McConnell, thank you for being here. And Mr. Secretary, please proceed with your opening statement.
Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for your continued support for the Army and our people. It's an honor and a privilege to appear before you today. I'd like to take a moment to thank my wife and children, and I'd like to thank my teammate, General McConville, for your lifetime of service to our Army and to our nation. And I'd like to thank Secretary Austin and Deputy Secretary Hicks for their return to public service and providing their leadership to the Department of Defense. I have continued to be amazed and impressed with the state of our Army and with the professionalism and hard work of our soldiers and leaders. When crises happen, our nation calls upon our Army and we respond. In support of COVID-19 pandemic, natural disasters, civil unrest, southwest border, and deterrence in the Middle East and across the globe. I'd like to use my remarks to highlight 4 key observations on the state of our Army that I've made in my 3.5 months in this position. First, the Army is now a DoD leader in technology and concepts. From AFC to the cross-functional teams to our Rapid Capabilities Office to individual unit commanders, the Army is prototyping and experimenting with new capabilities and formations. The Army is at the forefront of developing and fielding new technologies in areas such as counter-UAS, assured PNT, directed energy, hypersonics, next-generation soldier equipment like IVAS, pushing software coding the edge, and many other areas. Second, the Army is at the center of opening doors in the Indo-Pacific and Europe. The Army is key to engaging in Indo-Pacific and European allies and partners to win in competition, establish credible deterrence, and set conditions for success in conflict. Deterrence requires boots on the ground, and DoD must be present to succeed in conflict. The Army is recognized as an enduring, reliable partner that can directly contribute to improving their defenses by bringing resources, training, and expertise. This partnership can lay the groundwork for contingency access and cooperation in a crisis. Third, the next fight will be an all-domain fight. Conflict in the Indo-Pacific or Europe will be in and across all domains, with ground forces to secure terrain, penetrate A2AD defenses, and achieve objectives. The Army's transformation is directly aimed at supporting joint warfighting that will depend upon JADC2, expeditionary joint logistics, and joint maneuver across domains. If the Army does not modernize, we will lose overmatch with near-peer adversaries, making conflict more likely and making its consequences more severe. Fourth, the Army's readiness gains and modernization procurement requirements need consistent budget support to survive. Recently, or several years ago, we recognized that readiness had declined precipitously after years of reduced funding and uncertain budgets. And we also recognized that we needed to modernize concepts, capabilities, and posture to be competitive in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Working in coordination with Congress, we rebuilt readiness. We established night courts that internally realigned funding to invest in modernization. The Army established a deliberate, achievable path to deliver a ready, modernized Army. We have made tremendous progress, but success is not guaranteed. Consistent, predictable, and sustained funding enables us to sustain readiness today and modernize for tomorrow. The Army has taken manageable risks to deliver the speed and capability needed to match our adversaries. But unforecasted operations and inconsistent funding are paid for from readiness, infrastructure, and modernization accounts. Finally, the Army must also contend with threats from within. The harmful behaviors of sexual assault, sexual harassment, racism, and extremism cannot and will not be tolerated. People are the Army. Our responsibility is to ensure every soldier has the right leadership, policies, and resources to thrive in trained, disciplined, and fit cohesive teams. That responsibility also extends to an inherent right to safety and our ability to effectively mitigate crimes and relentlessly prosecute criminals to ensure we maintain our focus on placing people first. Our Army is in a great place, but we still have significant work to do. We remain one of the most trusted institutions in the world, and we will continue to support the nation. I'd now like to turn the floor over to General McConville, and I look forward to taking your questions and our discussion.
Thank you. Sir, you're recognized.
And thank you, Chair. And Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for your continued support to the Army and our people, our soldiers, our families, our civilians, and our soldiers for life, our retirees and veterans. And the Army currently has 485,000 soldiers in the regular Army and a little more than 1 million in the total force. That is roughly the size Army that we had on 9/11. And today, Army soldiers, as you said, are presently sporting combatant commanders around the world in more than 140 countries. They form the most lethal and decisive land force in the world. They stand ready to fight and win the nation's wars as part of the joint force. As their chief, I could not be more proud of each and every one of them. Since last October, the Army's priorities have been people, readiness, and modernization, making us well aligned with the emerging national security guidance. Putting people first means recruiting and retaining the best talent a nation has to offer, maximizing their potential, and taking care of them. We are building a culture of cohesive teams that are highly trained, disciplined, and fight, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. That is how we prevent the harmful behaviors that hurt our soldiers and break trust with the American people. These being sexual assault and sexual harassment, acts of racism or extremism, and death by suicide. All three of my children, 2 sons and a daughter, plus my son-in-law, are currently serving in the Army. Providing a safe and secure environment for our soldiers is not only my responsibility as Chief of Staff of the Army, it's also a deeply held personal commitment. We win through our people. The best fighting forces in the world ensure that their soldiers and their units are masters of their craft. That is why we are shifting to a foundational readiness model that prioritizes training at the company level and below first. The Army has rebuilt a high level of readiness with the support of Congress, but that readiness level is fragile. We must sustain that high level of readiness while continuing our most comprehensive transformation and modernization efforts in over 40 years. That is the only way we'll maintain our overmatch against near-peer competitors and potential adversaries. This year, we are turning our multi-domain operations concepts into real doctrine. We're not only developing, but delivering on our 6 modernization priorities, including our 31+4 signature systems. With new doctrine, organizations, and equipment, the Army is offering multiple options to combatant commanders and multiple dilemmas to our competitors and adversaries. And we are doing so alongside our sister services and alongside our allies and partners. The U.S. Army never fights alone. We are the strongest land force in the world, and a great source of that strength comes from our alliances, our allies, and partnerships. As a people-based organization, we are uniquely qualified to foster these relationships. Thank you for your continued support to American sons and daughters in uniform. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. So, Mr. Calvert, before we go to questions, and I know that there's been you're aware of what I'm going to do here. Yesterday, we had a technical problem. Mr. Diaz-Balart is usually the first on and the last off with his camera on all the time. Yesterday was no exception. When it was his turn to be up to bat, the screen went dark. So, Mr. Calvert, and with the committees, because people are supposed to reserve their time if there's a technical issue. Mr. Calvert, with the committee, unless anyone objects, I would like to have Mr. Diaz-Balart ask the first question. Mr. Calvert?
No problem, Madam Chairman.
Committee members? Mr. Diaz-Balart, you are now recognized to ask the very first question.
Well, Madam Chairman, that was highly, very kind of you. Again, it doesn't surprise me. Your kindness never surprises me, but I'm touched. Thank you very much. My computer just died. It just turned off, so I apologize for that. It was on my side. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for your service. A couple of questions. Actually referring to, I echo the opening statement of the ranking members to the top line, which I think is highly irresponsible. But I'd also like to know how much you are currently spending and how much you are projected to spend on things that are not directly focused on readiness, on lethality, on modernization, on the traditional military issues, including on things that I obviously may support, like remediation of for sea level rise, et cetera. So how much are you spending on non-traditional issues such as environmental concerns, global warming, and that kind of thing now? And what do you expect to spend? And I don't expect an answer right now. But I'm also concerned that you don't have the necessary funding. You will not have the necessary funding to also execute the national defense strategy. Obviously, every service is expected to readjust its priorities based on what I believe are really inadequate funds. And oftentimes, as the largest the largest of the services, the Army seems to frankly pay the bills for defense cuts to minimize defense cuts everywhere else. So specifically, how do you think you'll be able to, if the top line number remains, what will that do to potentially your end strength numbers? General, you've talked about that in the past, and so any ideas to, we don't have the president's budget yet, but any ideas to what you are looking at may be your end strength numbers with the numbers that would be that are out there as far as the top line.
Want to go end strength?
Yeah, I'll go. And Congress, thanks for the question. On the end strength, as I said in the opening statement, the size of the Army right now is 485,000 regular Army and a little over 500,000 reserves, and basically it's about a 1 million person Army total force. That is the same size of the Army that we had on 9/11. If at least, and I'm on record for saying I would like to see a larger Army if the demands remain the same. Some of you have discussed about the stress on the force, and our force has been heavily committed over the last 20 years in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and Syria, and quite frankly, around the world. Many of our units are on what we call a 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 type dwell, where they're not home very much, and they've been doing it for 20 years. And so my concern is two reasons. One is we want to make sure we can reduce the op tempo on our troops. That includes our National Guard and Reserves, who have also been very heavily employed over the last 20 years, whether it's home in the country or it's overseas. And so when we take a look at end strength, I would like to grow the Army. We've done analysis. The previous chief talked about 540 to 550 is about the right size of the Army. I recognize that, quite frankly, we just can't afford that. And at least with what I see as budgets, but what we must do is keep that force we have, the force we have ready. And that's the second kind of bucket of money. We must keep the force ready. But even more importantly, as I look around the world and I see competitors there, and we want peace through strength, we must transform the Army, and that is modernizing it in the multi-domain operations concepts. That's bringing on new organizations and also the 6 modernization priorities, and working very closely with the Joint Force to do that.
General, you mentioned readiness, and that's usually an area that gets hit first, right? When the budgets are tight. Talk to us about reducing readiness, what that does to our soldiers and to your mission, and to what does that do when you start cutting readiness numbers as far as budget numbers?
So the first is we have data from what happened the last time in the sequester cuts. It can happen quickly, it can go deeply, and it takes a long time to rebuild. And what I'd say, actually, I'd combine readiness and modernization. Is if we let readiness slip, or if we don't continue our modernization to maintain our overmatch, what they do, Congressman, is they become provocative, and they make a conflict more likely, and they make the consequences of a conflict more severe if it were to occur. So that's really the bottom line, Congressman.
Yeah, I would say, kind of by way of example, if you were, a professional sports team and you never practiced, and then you were expected to go in the Super Bowl and actually play the game, we would never consider doing that. It's the same thing with our troops. They have to train, and really what that is deliberate practice and rehearsals and making sure that they're masters of their craft. Our ground troops have to do that. Our aviators have to do that. And the other thing that tends to happen is you start cutting. You start not spending maybe the money you need for spare parts. You don't necessarily, maintain. You'll wait for maybe 6 months to do the services that you need, and then you start building up a readiness gap that you just don't quite want that happen. You've been very supportive over the last couple of years, and as the Secretary said, our readiness is a good place, but that readiness can become fragile.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, and Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for recognizing me first. I was not ready for that. Luckily, I had just finished swallowing my peanut butter and jelly lunch. So, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
An all-American lunch. Gentlemen, picking up a little bit on readiness, it would be interesting for me to have you speak to just a minute. I had another question, but I think it's important to talk about Congress's failure to do a BRAC, and that is close installations and shut down facilities that we no longer serve mission. And our inability, because I did ask you to speak a little bit to this night court, and could you explain what the night court is? I know what it is, but we do have Americans participating at home listening to this, what night court is, and Congress's failure not to remove legacy equipment, because that is certainly, if you want to talk about a foot drag, that's a big foot drag on your budget.
Yes, Chair McCollum, that's an excellent question, and I'd be happy to talk about our night court process. So we really started about 3 years ago, and the chief mentioned it, and I've mentioned it, and that was the imperative of modernization. And we knew that resources were going to be scarce even at that point in time. So what we started to do is we combed through every line item of the budget, and what we looked for were programs that were lower priority than our modernization priorities. And it was not to say that any of those programs were unimportant or did not contribute, but what we were looking for was the prioritization of programs. And so what we did in that first round was we either eliminated or reduced about 180 programs. We continued that that was in the 2020 budget build process. We continued that in the 2021 budget build process, and we will continue that, and you'll see the results of that in the 2022 budget process. What it is prioritizing and making sure that we are putting our dollars, the dollars you've entrusted to us, that the taxpayers have entrusted to us, to our highest priorities, which are, as we've said, people, readiness, and modernization.
And if I could add one thing from like a strategy, the last major time that we modernized the Army was really in the 1980s, late 70s. And that's when we came with our big five modernization priorities: the Abrams tank, the Bradley, the Black Hawk, the Apache, and the Patriot. And there were some other systems. And what we've done over the last 40 years is incrementally improve those systems. And those systems are much better than they were when they started, and they've gotten progressively better. But we find ourselves in a place where we need to transform those systems, take advantage of the technologies available today, and replace those systems over the next 10 years. So for the next 40 years, we have the ability to incrementally improve the new systems that we have. And we realize that we have to do that ourselves as far as managing the money within the Army. We can't do everything. And as a secretary, that's why we prioritized where those recommended cuts would be.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have other questions, but at this point, I would like to turn to our ranking member, Mr. Calvert, for his, and then it will be Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On April 14th, President Biden said, while we will not stay involved in Afghanistan militarily, our diplomatic and humanitarian work will continue. On May 1st, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, in the worst case analysis, you have a potential collapse of the government, a potential collapse of the military, you have a civil war, and you have all the humanitarian catastrophe that goes with it. General, the Army currently has a majority of the troops still in Afghanistan. From the Army perspective, how do you avoid the worst case scenario and continue the diplomatic and humanitarian mission in Afghanistan with no troops on the ground?
Well, we're going to be dependent on the Afghan security forces, and I myself commanded the 101st Airborne Division in Afghanistan. I was there as a deputy commanding general. When we first got there, American soldiers did almost all the fighting, and then we moved into a phase where we called it Shana Bashana. We were fighting side by side with the Afghan security forces. When I arrived there as the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, my job was to get the Afghan security forces in the lead, and we were able to do that, and we drew down. I had 25,000 soldiers in Regional Command East, and we went down about 7,800 and turned it over to then Steve Townsend, and he did the elections and took it from then. And right now, as you've seen, we're at a much lower level, around 2,500 soldiers. But as our soldiers leave, the Afghan security forces are going to have to pick up that security capability. And right now we have to wait and see how that's going to play out. There is other diplomacy going on because there is going to be some type of political solution. I think as General Milley has talked about, there's a lot of alternatives that could be, and we're in a position right now where we're executing the president's decision, and we have to wait and see how that turns out.
Secretary, we all know that withdrawing troops has a price. Salaries, other expenses for the Afghan National Security Forces will endure as long as they're around. There are contracts for a lot of property, buildings, equipment, a network of private entities. Afghanistan is obviously landlocked, so moving items by truck is much trickier given its location, availability of seaports and airports nearby. Yet air and sea lift would cost anywhere from 2 to 5 times as much as using a wheeled vehicle for transport. Finally, moving troops out of Afghanistan is really just dealing with a problem from far away, which adds to expense. So when you talk about saving money on the withdrawal, has the department even begun to calculate these long-term costs that associate with the withdrawal?
Yes, sir. We are working on that. But as I think you're pointing out in your question, it's a very difficult estimate to make. So right now, the bulk of the costs for the change in posture are 2021 budgetary costs, and we'll see how that goes, and if we're able to cover that with available resources, or if we have to readjust or realign. The next challenge after that will then become the 2022 funding level. We're still working out what the policy will be. We still have to see what the results of the change in posture will be. So what you'll see when we do submit our 2022 budget to you is you will see a reduction in funding, but you will see some funding remain. And the risk that we face and the conversation and the dialogue we'll have to have with you is, as we get more information and as events unfold on the ground, we'll learn, is that amount of money that's been left appropriate? Is it too much? Is it too little? And we'll make adjustments as we need to, working with you and your colleagues.
Yes, Secretary. It's my experience with these estimates that they are never accurate, and it always costs more than we assume that it will be. So we'll see how that goes.
That's
one
been our
last
experience as well, Congressman. I'm very much with you, sir.
One add to this. Are there going to be contingency plans if things go terribly wrong? I would hate to see another ISIS type situation, mass executions in Afghanistan. Is there any contingency plans you're setting up in case something like that occurs?
Well, I'll take that as far as General McKenzie and General Miller in coordination with the Secretary. There are contingency plans.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Kilmer and then Mr. Rogers, please. Mr. Kilmer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Secretary Whitley, I was happy to see in your written testimony, you mentioned the Army's commitment to prioritizing mitigating the impacts of climate change. The DoD certainly can be a leader in combating climate change, particularly through using innovative building materials, renewable materials, and composites, including cross-laminated timber, look to be a critical tool in the Army's efforts to combat climate change. I often say that we have more trees than people in my neck of the woods. Growing up in the Olympic Peninsula, I certainly saw firsthand how important timber and wood products are to supporting good-paying jobs in our communities. Not only is cross-laminated timber a job creator, but it's resilient and it has a smaller carbon footprint. So Secretary Whitley, I know that the Army has been a leader in using CLT with 6 Army lodging facilities that have been constructed using the material. I was pleased to hear that the latest CLT construction project at Fort Jackson resulted in over 40% reduction in crew size and man hours when compared to the construction of a conventional Army lodging facility. In fact, estimates are that CLT lodging facilities will be completed 37% faster than conventionally framed facilities. So I think these benefits underscore the importance of collaboration between the Army and Congress to expand the use of these innovative and sustainable building materials. So here's my question. Have you encountered any barriers to using CLT or other innovative materials that Congress can help remove? And has the Army identified other projects where the use of CLT could be beneficial?
So I asked that question after I learned of your interest and support in this, Congressman. And what I can say right now is there has been extensive use, the use that you cited. That's primarily been with Army partners. And so what we're exploring right now is the Army's direct use of those. And my understanding is there are some regulatory challenges we're working through. I'm not personally conversant in those at the moment. So we're working through that. They're educating me. And what I'd commit to you, Congressman, is as we finish that and we understand what those challenges are, we'd like to sit down with your team and work through those and figure out what the right way forward is.
I sure appreciate that. Thank you. Let me shift gears, General McConville. I know the Army's focused on delivering next generation capabilities to the force at the speed of relevance. The Integrated Visual Augmentation System is a prime example of a technology system which was recently approved to move from rapid prototyping to production and rapid fielding, allowing the technology to get into soldiers' hands faster. In your written testimony, you mentioned that soldier-centered design was a key component and best practice in the IVAS prototype and production process. So here's my questions. One, what lessons learned from the IVAS process and the soldier-centered design could be applied to other material modernization efforts? And can the IVAS technology, a sensing, decision-making, target acquisition, and target engagement situational awareness tool, translate to other larger Army platforms and weapons systems?
I think IVAS is a good example where we're trying to go with acquisition as a whole. We had an idea of a transformational capability. It was really an improvement on our night vision goggle capability, but I almost use that as an example of the phone. The phone was incrementally improved, and then the iPhone came in with that kind of transformational capability. We were incrementally improving our night vision goggle capability. Then all of a sudden, IVAS came in, and it's we're still using soldier touch points. So we've had soldiers working with engineers as we've gone through the process. We're learning a lot about that, and the company orchestrating that was someone we didn't even know they had that capability. But we had put a problem set out there. We put characteristics out there, and then we're able to go through the process of developing that capability. But that capability, I think, is going to transform how our soldiers operate. We've got some more work to do that. I don't want to overpromise, where we're at, but I got tremendous. We got a lot of visionaries that can see that thing being used in a whole bunch of ways that we never even conceived of the ability to provide information to soldiers, but also the ability to put our soldiers on the battlefield where they don't necessarily need to be in harm's way because they can take advantage of the augmented reality or the virtual reality and actually be a place with sensors where they're not at. And it's just, you could be under an armored weapon system and be able to see outside and what we're doing with our troops. But again, we have more work to do on that. We're not done yet. But we're moving very, very quickly because we're working really closely with the engineers.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I probably don't have time to slip in one more question, so I'll yield back.
Well, we know that your district's beautiful, your people are wonderful, and your wood is strong. So you're right on message, and thank you for the time I was in your district. Mr. Rogers and then Mr. Aguilar.
General McConville, good to see you again, and welcome to both of you for being here today. I want to ask the General about the future of the Chinook helicopter in a moment, but let me first join many others who are frustrated that we have yet to receive the President's budget request for the next fiscal year. We've had a so-called skinny budget application, which would not even keep the military up with inflation, and actually be a cut in spending. So what do you think? Can you manage the confrontations we're facing around the world with less than you had this year, Mr. Secretary?
So I think there is a lot of risk in the budget, Congressman. What I can say is and I said this a little bit in my opening remarks, we've rebuilt readiness. That was hard. We realized once it got down to the low level it got, how hard rebuilding it was. And we've started, and we're in the early stages of what we think is what we hope to be one of the most successful modernization efforts in the Army's history. So on one hand, the Army's in a very good place today. But on the other hand, to get there, we've built risk into the budget. We know that readiness can turn on a dime. And as we've talked about through the night court process, we've self-funded. We realigned resources to fund a lot of that modernization effort. The Army's budget has actually been flat for the last 2 to 3 years. So our concern is to keep these efforts going. We need to have consistent, sustained, and predictable funding. And we're in very good shape today. But what we've learned and what we know is that there's risk and you can lose those gains very quickly.
Thank you. General McConville, let me take you back to your old stomping grounds at Fort Campbell, where you commanded the 101st, and is the home base of the Chinook. And there's been some debate about the future of that great machine. Where are we on it now, and what's the plans?
Well, as you know, Congressman, the 101st Airborne Division is the premier air assault division in the world. It's highly dependent on helicopters, and quite frankly, the CH-47 has been the workhorse really around the world, but specifically in Afghanistan. There's also another unit there, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment also flies the CH-47. It's a great aircraft. It's our newest aircraft right now in the United States Army. I think we're right around between 470 and 500 of those models. And, a decision that's going to need to be made is what do we do with this aircraft as we move into the future? You probably know that we have a Block 2 model, which is in the process of being developed. That's going to give us the capability to lift things like the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle and give us a much greater payload. And the decision the Army is going to have to make based on the resources, while trying to understand the importance of maintaining the industrial base, is where we're at. From my point, we want to get to Block 2. And, if you don't get to Block 2, then you have a different discussion. But you need to get that aircraft to Block 2. That's where we're sporting to make sure you have that capability. That will put that aircraft in a much better place. And then based on the resources that we have in the prioritization, that'll drive the decision made on where we go with the CH-47.
Well, you're testing the Block 2 now, aren't you?
We are. Again, I don't want to get into where we are, but the intent is to work that, and we have invested in that capability, and we want to make sure we can get that through the operational test to make sure we have that capability. But that is a capability that we want, and that'll drive the decision making in the future. Will
you be requesting money for the Block 2?
Well, right now, for the sector, you want to take?
So, unfortunately, I really can't talk about, one, it's still being finalized, and two, I can't really talk about the FY22 request. We do have the FY21 funding. We're executing that funding now, and we'll come in at the appropriate time and walk you through everything that's in the 22 request, Congressman.
All right. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Just for the record, I too am disappointed we don't have a full budget in front of us. It would be a much different and more robust discussion that we would be having. But President Trump, in his first year of administration, his full budget wasn't out until May 22nd. We need to remember that we had COVID. It's still among us, affecting some of our productivity. And we had a transition that did not go smoothly. We are all very aware of that, as well as the disturbance on January 6th. So as of right now, I agree it would be great to have a budget in front of us, but the Biden administration, I think we need to be mindful of when the Trump budget came out on the 23rd of May and the three challenges: COVID, the transition, and January 6th. Mr. Aguilar and then Mr. Womack, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Assistant Secretary, and in general. I was pleased to see that your written testimony highlighted the Army's development of a ground-based long-range hypersonic weapon. In the prior fiscal year, this committee provided the Army with $60 million above the President's request to support these efforts. So why don't we start with Assistant Secretary Whitley. How will this funding help the Army achieve its mission to win against any adversary?
Well, hypersonics is a critical capability to maintain overmatch with our adversaries, with near-peer adversaries. I actually, in my previous job, I was the acting CAPE director, and we led a large analytic effort, looking at long-range precision fires, and developed what is now the department's portfolio-based approach to that, with the Army having the ground component of that. So when you look at Europe, when you look at the Pacific, in particular in the Pacific, where you see the ranges that you see and the anti-access area denial environment in which we'd be operating, hypersonics is a critical capability for our overmatch. In your funding and the funding you'll see in the 22 request and in future requests is going to start fielding real capability. We hope to have a real capability fielded in FY23 with first battery, and then to be fielding additional capability in the years following that.
But we'll continue to make progress with the FY22 request?
Yes, sir.
I appreciate that. Like a lot of my colleagues, I've been concerned about white supremacist and extremist ideologies in our armed forces. In fact, I introduced some legislation which would have required DoD to act upon some recommendations based on NDAA language that we secured a few years ago, not just at time of enlistment. We know that responsibility to identify individuals with extremist ideologies doesn't end after recruitment. Assistant Secretary, what steps are you taking to align with Secretary Austin's DoD-wide stand down to prevent and address extremism?
We executed the stand down that the Secretary directed. We had 100% compliance by the dates with the active duty, and the reserve folks should be finishing up very shortly. So we're 100% aligned with the Secretary. It's an issue that we had seen and that we'd been following and that we'd been taking action on already. And, you know, the Chief and I have both made very clear to our soldiers that extremism, racism, these types of behaviors are just unacceptable in our Army. They're inconsistent with the Army's values. We've talked to our soldiers. I've talked to soldiers about, advocating for violence, about things that are disruptive, racist behavior that would be disruptive to a unit. That's a readiness. That's a directly, it's an attack on our soldiers, and it's a direct hit to the readiness of the military. So we've been very actively involved with the Secretary's initiatives.
Anything to add, General?
I just think it's these, and we talked a little about my opening statement about harmful behaviors. We are very blessed that the American people trust their Army, they trust their military. And if we have harmful behaviors like extremism, racism, sexual harassment, sexual assault, parents aren't going to send their sons and daughters to the Army. And so we take that very, very seriously. You all have to trust us that we're going to do the right thing the right way. And so these behaviors cannot be in our Army. And even if they're small numbers, they taint the heroism of all those soldiers who serve honorably. So we just can't have that.
Mr. Secretary, do you anticipate any additional resources being needed to accomplish some of the objectives with respect to this?
Well, that's being worked out within the department, and I don't want to get ahead of the processes that Secretary Austin has directed and is leading. So I'd say that's being worked out. But I'd say overall, though, this is not primarily a resource issue. This is a cultural issue, and this is a leadership issue, and that's the primary approach that we're taking.
Thank you both. Appreciate it. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. Great question, good discussion. Mr. Womack and then Ms. Bustos.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Mr. Secretary and Chief. Great to see both of you again. Appreciate your service. Those of you, most of you already know that a little over a week ago, I took Ranking Member Calvert, Mr. Cuellar, a couple of others up to West Point, where I have the the honor and privilege of serving as the Board of Visitors Chair. I want to give a shout out to Daryl Williams, the soup up there, for the great hospitality that they gave. And to my fellow colleagues here on the Defense Subcommittee, anytime that you would like to go up to the U.S. Military Academy, and I know the same would go for Air Force and Navy as well, but particularly as it concerns West Point, let me know, and I'd love to be able to help arrange that trip and accommodate you in whatever capacity we can. I think having an opportunity to sit down or go visit a classroom of some of these young men and women that have pledged themselves to becoming military officers in the greatest army in the world charges my batteries, and I know it'd do the same for you. So if you ever have an opportunity to do that, please coordinate with me, and we'll make that happen. I want to get back to the readiness question a minute, because I joined Ranking Member Calvert and all my other colleagues that have talked about the inability to have a budget right now and to be able to talk about it. I'm afraid that when we do have a budget that we can talk about, we're not going to be pleased with the results, because it's going to force us into making some terrible decisions, some very unfortunate decisions. We make our decisions, though, based on threats known and perceived around the world and where we may have to be required. But I want to talk about the requirements piece of what eats away at the budget. And these are not necessarily issues regarding our adversaries necessarily. It's just what we ask our Army to do above and beyond its trained specialty. So, Ms. Secretary, General McConville, we have to come to grips as a country that if we're going to accept less resources, those requirements are going to have to be pared down as well. Am I correct?
Absolutely, Congressman. I mean, when you look at what your Army is doing today, and it's not only overseas, and it's domestically as well, as what we've done with COVID, what we're doing on the Southwest border, what we did with Capitol security, and all of those were important missions. And when our nation asks, the Army will always respond. But it gets to your exact point, which is our Army is overextended today. And as the Chief mentioned a little bit ago when he was talking about end strength. End strength is driven by the requirement, and right now the requirement exceeds the available resources.
Conville, do you want to comment?
I absolutely agree with the Secretary. We often say we're going to take risks, and what do we mean by taking risks when we don't give the resources that need? That means that risk is going to be on the back of our soldiers. It's going to be back of our soldiers' families, who are going to have them deployed much more than they probably should. And, we have to reduce the demand, but, we're going to set the supply with the resources that we have. And these soldiers that we have in the Army right now have been in constant conflict for the last 20 years. And as I look at the history, we haven't seen that, at least in my experience.
I got a quick question about talent management. We're now, 2 or 3 years into the talent management piece that we've gone to. How is it working? What tweaks are we making? And because I know this is also budget consideration of the budget, because the better you manage your talent, the fewer people maybe you have to train over time, because you can keep them longer and have them focused on their areas, and which helps retention. So this is a big piece of our budgetary considerations, is it not?
Yeah, can I take? I'm very passionate. Thank you for asking that question. We're in a war for talent in the United States Army and the United States military. And what we have to do with the young men and women today is we compete for their talent. We have to manage their talent. We have to recognize what their knowledge, their skills, their behaviors. And we've even added a P for preferences, which probably in the Army is a little blasphemous. We want to know what people want to do and where they want to go. And what we're finding is when we get people in the right place, in the right job, and take advantage of their talents and provide them the quality of life that they want, we're getting incredible people across the force in areas that we never thought we could. We just stood up a software factory, and I ran into a young specialist who was a medic but we broadened their capabilities and asked people that had the capability to code, and he's one of the best software coders that we have in the United States Army. He's a specialist in the Army. I asked him why he would do this. Quite frankly, probably making mid six figures outside the Army is because we recognized his talents. He wanted to be part of this team, and he saw purpose in what he was doing. Now, we're going to take care of him coming up the ranks, but we have 1 million soldiers like that in the Army, and I have 3 millennials that's serving, and they want us to recognize their individual talents. So we are moving from an industrial age system to a 21st century talent management system, and we are aggressively going after and competing for diversity. So we represent the nations, and everyone has an opportunity to feel part of the team.
Thank you so much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. And Mr. Womack's correct. Please reach out to him if you're interested in attending West Point. I was on one of the trips, and it was very enlightening, and thank you for your leadership on that committee, as well as those who serve on the Air Force and Naval Academy. Ms. Bustos and Mr. Carter, then Mr. Ryan. Ms. Bustos.
All righty. Thank you very much, Chairwoman McCollum. And I want to thank you and also Ranking Member Calvert for holding this important hearing. General McConville and Acting Secretary Whitley, thank you for your service. Thank you for your leadership of our soldiers. Thank you for your testimony and your thoughtful opening remarks. What I'd like to focus on is your materiel modernization transformation. The Rock Island Arsenal, which is, I know my colleagues on this subcommittee know this, but it is in the congressional district that I serve. You may be aware of this already, but it is literally on an island in the middle of the Mississippi River, right between Iowa and Illinois, but it is represented by the congressional district that I serve. We're really encouraged by the important work that they're doing at the Arsenal that supports warfighter, the warfighter, it sustains the Army. And I also want to thank you for your recent your investment in the additive manufacturing capability at the Arsenal, that it allows the Arsenal to process parts that we understand are providing big dividends to sustaining readiness. That said, we are particularly excited about the development of a jointless hull that uses an entirely novel and very, very large 3D printer. So either one of you can answer this, or both of you can answer this. But in the past, we've talked about how we see additive manufacturing capabilities to be more mobile and deployable downrange. So I think we have some examples where these mobile additive manufacturing systems are being sent downrange. But I also wonder if you can comment on how the Army is looking to ensure that these new and these innovative capabilities are built into existing or new major acquisition programs like the jointless hull.
I think you've been there.
Yeah, I have. I've actually been to Rock Island, and I think that's a great example of I want to say this politely, but sometimes we want to stay in the past. There's an Arsenal that's moving in the future. It's recognizing that maybe the way we did business in the past is going to change, and so we are very supportive of additive manufacturing. And here's how I see it: is the ability to make parts. Historically, we used a strategy. Some people called it an Iron Mountain. You bring a whole bunch of things with you, and it's very, very expensive. And you like every commander wants to have every part with them, which goes against a business practice, which is just-in-time logistics, because no one wants to have a part that's just a little late. And from my feeling, what additive manufacturing does, it allows you to take risk in some parts. You may have a part that you don't really carry because you only use it once a year, and why, carry around 20 parts and have that expense. But with additive manufacturing, you can manufacture that part right there and reduce that risk. You don't have to carry a large supply, which again requires more vehicles, requires all these other type things to do that. So I think that's extremely important. So what are we doing to get after that? What we're seeing is working with manufacturers. You have to actually get the parts from them and get the diagrams, and then you can put them into the machines and make sure that you basically order the parts through the machines. Some there's a I think it's University of Wichita has actually done a UH-60, the whole thing. They're taking total weapon systems basically put them in the machine so you can manufacture, some people call it print, those parts. I think that's the future. I think you're going to see additive manufacturing at the leading edge of the battlefield. And then in the rear, you want to be able to reach back and say, hey, we don't want to wait 18 months. We don't want to wait this long to get that part. We want to be able to manufacture it right now.
Very good. Acting Secretary, anything that you'd like to add to the General's comments?
No, I just agree with what the chief said. I think this is, we're getting it right now at the depot and arsenal level, and we're learning from that. Where this ultimately is going to go is to the tactical edge, and I think it's going to be a real potential in a warfight.
So along those same lines, obviously we've been talking a little bit about the budget, and my personal concern that the Navy's modernization may result in cuts to the Army's budget. And I know you specifically cannot comment on details of the budget, but wondering what impact it could have on adopting innovative capabilities into the Army programs.
Yeah, it will have an impact, and this is, and I don't want to repeat myself, but what we've got right now is an Army budget that has risk built into it. It was prudent risk. It was risk taken to fund modernization and to be a good steward of the taxpayer resources. But what that means is, then when funding becomes unpredictable, you don't have buffers. You don't have the ability to absorb that as easily as you otherwise might. So there is risk in the budget. We are going to protect modernization, and we are going to fund modernization because of its high priority. But there is risk there, and there will be things we cannot do.
Okay, very good. My time's expired. Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bustos. Mr. Carter and Mr. Ryan, and then Mr. Cole. Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, General, welcome. I appreciate you keeping me in the loop when you came by the office and we visited. As it looks to us, even though I'm not going to beat that dead horse about a late budget, we all know we're unhappy about that. But what we really ought to be concerned about is that it looks like the Army is going to take the lion's share of the cuts as we look at the Defense Department. As we look at that, and the three priorities, which are almost mandatory priorities that you listed, General, are our main concern for the men and women that serve in our United States Army. So I want to ask you, first and foremost, Futures Commander, is something I believe in. The concepts that you're working on now are really good. Ms. Bustos, what she pointed out, that's great stuff. And that's all coming out of the Army's new way of thinking. But if we have to cut our futures, looking at our plans for our near future, if we have to cut soldiers, those two things are items that we just can't afford to cut. You can't create a sergeant major once you fired him. And so we've got to figure out some kind of compromise with us taking all these. I once read in an article that if the Army took the full load, we'd probably lose an armored brigade combat brigade. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I guess, we're certainly, at least from where the Chief of Staff of the Army serves, is I know very clearly where we need to invest in. We have a very, very good program. We've laid out what we think our end strength requirements are. We know what our readiness requirements are. And quite frankly, we think we have a very good approach that we're continuing from General Milley and myself as the vice, and our modernization priorities have not changed, and we continue to experiment with them to make sure they're the right ones. But we believe that, at least from the military standpoint, we are offering the right way ahead for the Army, and the resources we get, we know where we'll have to make cuts, and if we don't get the resources that we think we need, then it's by by law, I have an obligation to come back to you and lay out what those unfunded requirements are.
I would just add, Congressman, you can think about the risks when you think about end strength, when you think about readiness, that's to operations today, and that's being ready to go today. When you think about modernization, that is to maintain our overmatch into the future against our adversaries. And when you think about our recapitalization of units with the equipment that they have today, that's about the next several years and maintaining our capability over the coming years. So as I said before, we have risk in the budget today. There is not a situation where we can say, if we have less, we'll still continue to do the same level of effort. The question is, where are we going to take that risk? Are we going to take risk against operations today? Are we going to take risk against our fielding of replacement equipment for operations over the next several years? Or are we going to take risk against modernization and our ability to maintain overmatch with near-peer adversaries? That is the choice facing the Army at the moment.
And if you had to, and I think we all realize you're going to face that choice.
Mm-hmm.
And being the home of a lot of, armored brigades, that's a concern that I have. That's why I'm asking the question. I know that the brigade combat teams, armored, are your most expensive combat teams. There's no doubt about that. But aside from the material, the human beings, what I'm worried about, because if you're cutting soldiers, you can buy them, you can buy a tank on the market, you can buy guns on the market, but you can't buy a soldier. Once he's gone, and you can't train him back up. Most chances you don't get him back in. That's that decision that I don't want to see the Army have to make. And I hope as we look at budgets, we got to first take care of these people who have been in harm's way now for 20 years on our behalf. And the Army has taken the lion's share of the casualties and the lion's share of the work. We've been helped with our allies. We've been helped with our fellow warriors in every one of the services. But they've been in the bloodbath. And the punishment at the end is awfully rough. That's one of the things I'm really concerned about. And I don't think we're going to see any 540 or 550 in this next budget as far as in strength. So we're going to have to, I just don't want to see us cut our in strength if we don't have to. That was my number one question. And the other thing is high level of readiness. I'm worried about us losing training time. So I'm just asking questions. You going to be able to keep the levels with the cuts we anticipate of training time?
Gentlemen, if you can answer that quickly for Mr. Carter, based on your information on what's in the, what you can speak about to the budget, I'd appreciate that.
Well, what I can do is I can say a commitment. We're not going to send young men and women into combat that are not trained, and so when it comes to readiness, we're going to make sure they have that. And again, that's why it puts stress on end strength, or it puts stress on modernization, because if the resources are reduced, something has to give, or it could be in quality of life for our soldiers and families.
Thank you both. Thank you for your service.
Important questions to have answered when we see the budget, Mr. Carter. Thank you for raising them. Mr. Ryan, then Mr. Cole, then Cuellar, and Capter. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the panelists. General McConville, in the recent budget request, the Army's funded 1.5 brigades of upgraded Abrams tanks, which are made in Lima, Ohio. And this is a clear demonstration in my mind of the Army's commitment to its armored brigades. And in light of the Army's continued focus on our near-peer adversaries, it seems to me that there'd be no reason to decrease production of upgraded Abrams tanks in the coming years. I understand fully that you're looking to find funding for modernization, but I want to caution the Army against doing that on the back of our defense industrial base if the Army sees a future in eventually modernizing the Abrams tanks, we need to have a robust production line to help get us to that point. And I was hoping that you could share your expectations about the Army's continued level of commitment to the Abrams tank program.
Well, I think you bring up a great point. First of all, some have questioned why we continue to invest in the Abrams tank, and goes back into Congressman Carter, the 1st Cav Division. We've got a lot of experience. A lot of the senior leaders have used armor in places like Sardis City in Iraq and in any urban environment. We think that's very, very important to have. The question becomes, and this is the tough decisions that the Secretary, and with my advice, will have to make as we get our resources. And we talk about CH-47s, we talk about the Abrams tank, we talk about all these great weapon systems that we need. And then what do you do if you don't get the resources you need? Well, what that drives you to is maybe slowing down what you want to do. And, again, we're going to have to come back once we see what the resources are. And that may drive us to make some tough decisions that people are not going to like.
Well, we've been in this boat before. The concern is we ratchet it down to a level that it becomes nearly impossible or super expensive to ramp it back up. Madam Chair, I'd like to put a question in the record with regard to some of the food and nutrition issues with the Army. We pay a lot in healthcare costs, the VA healthcare costs, a lot of it around diabetes. And issues like that I think are coming directly from the food system and in the Army and other branches of the military. So I'll be asking a question for the record on that, and I hope, General, that you can get me that information. The other thing that I find interesting, and I hope you could maybe share a little bit about, is the Project Pele, the Transportable Advanced Nuclear Microreactor prototype. And if you could just explain, I know the tremendous use of energy in the Army and really across the military, and we talked a little bit about some of these innovative ways. Can you talk a little bit about how the Army is preparing to adopt this technology, different technologies, but more precisely the nuclear microreactors?
I'll just lead off with that, Congressman. I'll say we are aware of the project. We're watching it. We're watching it closely with interest. And as you say, we have significant energy needs in theater. And as we start thinking about some of the other things that we're working on, like potential electrification of some of the vehicle fleet and things like that, that's going to increase our power needs in a deployed environment. So we are watching Pele very closely, and we hope that it proves successful. We'll look at other options as well, and we do have to solve the forward power problem for the future. Do you want to add anything?
No, I just say that, that's what they call a SCO that's being done at the Office of Secretary of Defense. It's not really an Army program right now.
Okay. Thank you. I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and I hope, Mr. Ryan, your question includes what is going on at DOD Department of Defense schools for our students there as well. We have Mr. Cole. Good to see you, Mr. Cole. And then we have Mr. Cuellar and Captor. And somebody has their mic on. If they just take a second and check that out so Mr. Cole can ask his question uninterrupted. I think you're ready to go, Mr. Cole. I think we've got it all calmed down for you. Take it away.
I appreciate you very much, Madam Chair. And sorry I'm late, but as you know, I was at another hearing, and thank you for indulging me. I want to make a general point about the overall budget and then ask a specific question. And my general point, I actually agree with the chair in the sense that I'm not critical of the administration for being a little late getting their budget to us. I understand the new administration. It happens to all of them. It's not unusual, and this one's had unusual circumstances to deal with. I think that's a fair point. I am concerned just looking at the skinny budget and what the level is. And I make this point, and not in a partisan way, but just to remind the committee that, look, we can do what we want here. The original Trump budget called for a generous increase, if I recall correctly, about $54 billion. We didn't think it was enough given what had happened under sequestration. And we had to move that to $80 billion. In other words, $26 billion higher than the administration asked for in the first Trump budget. I think that served the country well. I think it helped us recover quickly. It's not just that $26 billion. That's then the baseline, and that's moved forward every since then, and that's given us capability to address some long-term problems that we all know needed to be addressed. So presidents propose, Congress disposes, and I think when we look at the overall budget as proposed, president has 16-17% increase in domestic spending programs, essentially flat, inflation-adjusted minor cut for the military. I don't think that's acceptable. I think we're going to have to come to a deal that puts additional resources on the military side and probably detracts a little bit from what the administration would want to do domestically. That's just normal policy making, in my view. And that deal, in my view, would be much, much better than a CR, which I don't think any of us on either side of the aisle want to do. My specific question really dovetails quite nicely with my friend from Ohio's question about Abrams tank point. Recently, I'm privileged to represent Fort Sill, so field artillery, air artillery, those things are extraordinarily important to me. And the PIM program, the Paladin Integrated Management Program, recently was awarded finally full rate of production to ensure that our soldiers are outfitted with its most modern capabilities. The Army's actually invested pretty heavily in this program over the past decade. I understand that production's on schedule to meet current and targeted needs as outlined in the program baseline, and that's about 60 sets or 120 vehicles per year. That's a good thing. It's taken us a while to get there, and I applaud everybody that's worked with us and the Army's good efforts to do that. I'm curious if that is sort of the hope or plan going forward, because again, as my friend Mr. Ryan mentioned, if you can't meet those targets, each individual unit starts becoming more expensive and you lose production capability. And so the problem he's concerned about with tanks, very similar to the problem that I'm concerned about with artillery. So if you could give us some view as to where we're headed in the program going forward.
Yeah, I can take that, Congressman, and thank you for your support at Fort Sill. Long-range precision fires and really fires generally is something that we're really going after. As we've taken a look at how the shift and the type of fighting we've been doing, it's been irregular warfare, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. As we move to large scale, the capability to do large scale ground combat operations, our fires are extremely important. And we're very pleased to see that capability coming into our units. And, the intent is, again, I don't want to get in front of the budget, but the intent is that those fires are extremely important, and working with the manufacturer and making sure that they can deliver those systems as we've worked our way through that at the appropriate level, we think is extremely important. But that will be, again, we don't know what the final resources are, and that will help impact that or inform that decision.
Well, again, I certainly understand that, General, and appreciate the answer, because I think the desire to get there is important. And we'll wrestle with the capabilities. I would again urge you, and I know you will do this, to make sure that unmet needs document really gives us clarity, and so that if we get into that kind of discussion and we add additional money, which frankly I think we will, that's just my personal opinion, that we do it in ways that are consistent with the professional judgments of the military as to what they would need if more resources were available. I think that's going to be an extraordinarily important document for us. But again, thank you both for your service very much. I appreciate it. Madam Chairman, thank you for your indulgence, and I yield back.
Mr. Cole, you're always welcome. Mr. Cuellar and then Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for having this meeting, and I want to thank our witnesses also, the Acting Secretary, and of course, General McConville. Thank you so much. Just a couple of quick statements, and then I have a couple of questions. Number one, I want to thank Steve Womack and, of course, Ranking Member for that trip that we did to West Point. It's pretty amazing what y'all are doing over there, what the Academy's doing. So I just have to say that, it doesn't matter which of the kids that we spoke to or young men and women, they were all outstanding. So I want to say thank you for what y'all do there. Second of all, I also, just as a quick note, I also worry about what's going to happen in Afghanistan. After so many lives that we've lost, after so much money that we spent there, I hope that we don't, and I know that, I heard the testimony, what you're all doing to get ready for, optional plans, what happens, but I do worry about the worst case scenario. I really worry that the Afghanistan Army just won't be able to withstand what's going to happen, and I worry about what could happen afterwards. So I just want to for the record, I do show concerns about that. I know the decision has been made, but I do worry about what's going to happen there. My question, quickly, and I think, General, this has been, we've spoken about this, but let me talk about what we learned from the Fort Hood Independent Review. And I want to thank you. I know we spent some time talking about this in the past, and spending time with LULAC also on this. So I want to thank you for what you have done. I think you all have implemented, at least as the time that this question was put together, was 20 recommendations out of the 70 recommendations. And I just want to ask you, where are you on the rest of the recommendations, and give us some sort of timeline, and whether you all intend to do that, because Fort Hood was the number one base that had the problems, but there are other bases. So tell us where you are on the rest of the recommendations.
I'll just answer very quickly with the numbers, Congressman. There were 70 recommendations. My predecessor, Secretary McCarthy, committed to acting on all 70, and that commitment remains in place. We have implemented about 20. I'll just give you approximate numbers, and we can ship over to you the precise numbers. We've executed about 20. We have about 10 scheduled for next month that'll be implemented. Then there's probably another 15 to 20 that'll be implemented by the end of this calendar year. And then that leaves about 20 to 25, which will spill over into next year, because they're larger issues that will require a multi-year effort to implement.
And if I could add just on the Fort Hood, this is something we're taking in. I had a chance to speak to Mrs. Guillen, and we're going to implement across the entire Army, and using this as a sense of urgency. And we set up a People First task force that's going around and getting after these things. But it's really not only those capabilities, but it's really about prevention. It's really about getting into the unit with the culture and the climate. And it's about having assessments in place for our commanders and future commanders, and what type of climate and culture they set. And the Sergeant Major of the Army has been really working closely with our non-commissioned officer corps to make sure they understand the importance of this. And again, we take this very, very seriously.
Thank you. And I want to thank you, of course, for the action. And can you all just keep the committee and my office informed as to where you are with the different implementations, just as to what you're covering. Thank you for doing this across the Army and not only Fort Hood. The other thing is, one of the things that I'm very interested is on human performance optimization. I know that you all have been working on it. Steve, you remember they covered that, Ken, at the West Point. But can you all put together what the Army's doing, different places, different areas? I'm looking at an article that I have, and it was done on human performance metrics, consensus findings, gaps, recommendations for future research, and it's different areas of the military, including the Army, that's doing this. Can you all put together what everybody's doing and send it to the committee? Because I'm a big believer, as the members are, on human performance optimization. And if y'all can just put that together, I got a research article, but it's not in plain English. I'm an attorney, I'm a PhD, but I still like to see things in plain English. Can you all put it all together and send it to the committee and to my office? I would appreciate it.
And we can, Congressman, and we're going aggressively after holistic health and fitness, and it's from things that people haven't thought about, like from nutrition, from what we're doing, even as far as sleep, and how and we're putting people in the units with physical therapists, dietitians, strength coaches, and really, as young men and women come in the Army, is really maximizing their potential. And quite frankly, some of the young men and women coming in to the Army don't have the fitness or some of those capabilities that we've seen in the past. We have to develop that when they come in.
All right, thank you. My time's up. Send us the info, and thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much. I yield back.
You're welcome, and we look forward to seeing that report on Fort Hood and what else the Army's doing around. Ms. Capter.
Thank you very much, Secretary Whitley and General McConville, for your service to our great country. I'm very interested in following on Congressman Cuellar's questions and your replies about the individuals coming into the armed services now may not be as fit. Maybe I'm misinterpreting what you said as in prior generations, but we know that surveys show that the average young person spends 7 hours in front of a blue screen daily, rather than the way people grew up in prior decades. One of my questions is, do you have trouble with your recruits in terms of situational awareness in theater? Do you have to train in a different way because they lack that in their own lives? And I'm interested in the changes that you have to make in training because of the individuals that are being recruited to serve. How has that changed inside? The other thing I wanted to ask you to provide me with, and you won't answer this now for me, but I'm very interested in transport and highly efficient transport, new research going on at DOD and other places to develop new engines, hybrid engines, hydrogen-powered vehicles. I'd like you to send me somewhere in America where I can better understand what's going on in those labs and those places. I'm located near the War and Tank Command, but I'm not sure that really has that responsibility. So I'm very interested in Army, ground transport, energy. This is a very strong interest of mine. And maybe you could direct me where to look more closely at DOD. But finally, another question I have related to the younger generation. We see across our country wanton behaviors that cause great violence in the misuse of weapons. And I've asked myself, I see becoming less and less secure in the environments in which they live. It's very destabilizing, these behaviors. People can't even go to the store now and not feel that they're threatened. Is there anything Army can do in its public relations activities to display proper behavior, respect for a weapon, and cast some of these individuals as outliers? I'm not quite sure how to do that. That's a psychological issue. But I think that you have something to offer there in community by community. You've had to spend much more time domestically because of the disruption that we're seeing across our society related to the improper use of weapons. Some of it's related to the drug trade, but also it's a perspective. I had constituents come up to me and tell me that their 11 and 12-year-olds were looking at young people killing one another with weapons as a game on social media. I don't know what station does that. I don't know what website does that. This is horrendous. I don't know who's feeding that, but it ought to be illegal to do that in this country and to get young people involved in that kind of thing. So I just am wondering about what's coming in your doors in terms of recruitment, the kinds of training you have to do, and then anything Army can do to help our society self-correct as citizens feel less secure where they live.
Let me just read off, Congressman, what you're saying. On the energy question, we will definitely get you that material, and we'll get you that promptly. On the kids, I'm going to ask the chief to answer that. I'll just say I have 2 children who spend all their time on phones, so I can personally attest to the challenges of giving them situational awareness and trying to instill in them some degree of discipline.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the young men and women that are coming into the military we're trying to recruit. Right now, only 29% of Americans are qualified, actually, even to come into the Army, and that includes, those who go to college. So we're in competition for talent. So only 29% are qualified to be, enlist into the Army. And then there's only 3 qualities that I would highlight that we're trying to go after. One is resilience. We find a lot of young men and women are just not very resilient anymore. I don't know how we bring them up, but we see that how young men, women react to stress or they react to failure. That's not very good. The second quality that we look for is fitness, physical and mental fitness. And as you say, you can be very smart, but you don't develop a lot of muscles except in your fingers when you're texting and you're using your phone. And the other thing we find, which was, again, I find interesting, is most of us grew up playing sports. You went outside and you played sports, and what we find right now is very few young men and women tend to play sports, and so they're not as physically or mentally fit as they need to be. And the third attribute is character. A lot of people may come in, and some of these young men and women may be very resilient. They grew up tough or whatever, but they have some character challenges. And what we're trying to do in recruiting is get after these, and not that one size fits all, but we kind of haven't figured out if someone's not fit. We have an occupational physical assessment test, so we can kind of get a sense if they can, coming in to recruiting, if they're not fit, we'll have them work with a recruiter and get them fitness. But these other attributes show up later. We're very concerned about behavior health and, quite frankly, suicides in the Army, and that tends to be resilience. We're very concerned about misconduct because everyone that puts on this uniform, if they go out and do something that doesn't make us proud, they taint everyone else that serves. The other thing I just add is, we support is a junior ROTC program, and that is not a program to bring people in. It's a citizenship program, but we find a lot of schools and people are very supportive of that program, and what we find is we have that in 10% of the high schools, but 49% of the young men and women that come into the military, at least in the Army, come not necessarily from the program, but come from a school that had a JROTC. So there's some value in being exposed to the military, and we think that is very, very important. The one thing I'll add too, I know some of you had a chance to go up to West Point, and the Academy nominations, I'm looking at myself. At 16 years old, I was working for the Quincy Sewage Department, and I had a senator named Kennedy from Massachusetts that gave me an opportunity to go to West Point, and that's all out there. And there's, from the Army, the military, ROTC scholarships, West Point Academy scholarships. So coming to the Army is just a great place to get ahead.
Thank you very much. And Madam Chair, I know my time has expired, but I will also ask you to, for the record, further elaborate on your phrase, Russia increases its disruptive behavior. I'm very interested in how Army views that.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll make sure that's written up the way that you want it and submit it as a question at the end, Ms. Capter. Very good. So we do have time to do another round. We're going to limit the round. And I was brief in my first question, so I want to go to a little bit build on what Mr. Kilmer talked about with climate change. Army installations over the past several years have really been threatened, and sometimes their mission readiness has been impaired by some of the superstorms that we have witnessed. You have a new directive, September 2020, to address threats caused by climate change and extreme weather, requiring planners to build resilience measures and to protect against impacts to readiness. So I would like you to maybe touch a little bit on the Army completed its rollout in the integration of the climate assessments tool. And I'm assuming that that's being used into what we will see in the upcoming budget. The next thing I want to touch on that is a result of climate change is what we have to do is developing a new strategy in the Arctic. And it's important that we keep the shipping channels open, we protect our access to our own natural resources, and that we don't have countries coming in claiming natural resources and staking down flags. China likes to refer to itself as a near Arctic nation, as you're aware of. And then you have challenges at Alaska Fort Wainwright and Joint Base Elmendorf and Richardson. So could you just maybe touch on your plan on being resilient for climate change for facilities, and also what is the Arctic doing as far as its modernization to be ready for cold weather and all-terrain vehicles and things like that? So modernization and resilience with climate change. Gentlemen?
I'll just lead off very briefly with some of the installation stuff and then turn it over to the Chief to talk about that, and in particular the Arctic strategy and our our investments in the Arctic. But on the installation front, as you pointed out, ma'am, every installation is required to now have an energy and water plan. We think we'll have all of those done by 2022. We've spent significant time and energy and investment of resources in reducing both the intensity of resource usage at our posts and then the resiliency of that, because we see that as a fundamental risk, particularly for force projection. If in the event of a significant war and we were mobilizing our forces, the vulnerability of our posts to either an electronic or a kinetic attack that would somehow disrupt the resources available in that post. So we have, over the last 15 or so years, we have actually reduced energy intensity at about 15% at our posts, and we've reduced water usage or water intensity usage about almost 30% in our posts over that period of time. And we are using the climate assessment tool, as you mentioned. So it's a challenge that we've taken very seriously from both an efficiency perspective and from the perspective of resiliency and force projection and readiness.
And then we just came out with our Arctic strategy as all the services have and align that. And as we take a look at what we're moving towards is, first of all, we have an administrative headquarters up there. We're looking to make that more an operational headquarters so they can participate as part of the joint force and any type of anti-access area denial capability to make sure that we can protect our interests. The brigade we have up there right now is a Stryker brigade, designed more as a deployment platform from there rather than operating in that environment. So we are developing the capabilities that we'll need and going back to the training that they are actually an Arctic brigade and they can operate in that cold weather. And that's a whole different set of skill sets. And it's also a different set of vehicles that we need to do that. We have mentioned that we're looking at some type of multi-domain task force up there that would have that capability once we work out the concept for an anti-access or even an anti-ship capability to work very closely with the other services to provide that capability. So those are the type of things that are developing right now that are going to fundamentally take a look at how we work in the Arctic much differently.
Well, thank you. And I know you train for extreme weather, and we've had a lot of people learn how to survive in extreme heat based on where our Army and services have been recently. But extreme heat does not prepare you for extreme cold. So I look forward to working with you on that. Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. General McConville, the Army is in the midst of a significant restructuring, as you mentioned in your opening testimony, as it shifts to the new multi-domain operations construct. Now, some of us are old enough to remember the development and implementation of the air-land battle construct back in the 1980s, which focused on the Army in Europe. This was a good fit, obviously, because Europe naturally lends itself to traditional Army core competencies given the existence of NATO, forward basing and infrastructure and terrain. The new multi-domain operations construct, however, seeks to focus the Army on both Europe and the Asian Pacific. By region, I also mean beyond Korea. Given the tyranny of distance in the Pacific and the lack of some enablers in Europe, obviously Germany, I was surprised to see their new budget numbers. I wasn't really surprised, but that was saddened by it. Will this stretch the Army too thin? And what will the Army need to implement this strategy in the Pacific? For example, will it need to permanently station more troops in the region, require the other services to increase their lift capability, or invest in more pre-positioned stocks? Thank you, John.
Yeah, well, and that's a wonderful question as far as from start as we take a look at, I fell into airland battle when I came in the Army. And if you think about it, it was really two domains. We were going to fight in Europe, basically on the land and in the air. And what we recognized is when we get into multi-domain operations, we believe, and we really haven't been contested like this, we'll be contested in every domain and by a potential very lethal adversary. So we'll certainly be contested on land, we'll be contested on the sea, which means we're going to be challenged moving equipment maybe back and forth, and maybe even have sea battles going back to World War II. We're going to see integrated air and missile defense is going to challenge our air capabilities that we really have not seen. We certainly didn't see that in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in irregular warfare. We're also going to be contested in space and we're going to be contested in cyber. And as we move to more technological force, that's going to be very concerning. We're going to have to deal with that. And so we think that is extremely important. Now, how do we get after that? First of all, we always get wrong where we think we're going to fight next. People always try to predict, but we never get it right. So we have to develop a general force, and that general force we're developing is being built to have the attributes of speed, range, and then convergence. And convergence is tying sensors and shooters together of the joint force to give us a decision dominance capability. And that's what we're doing in Project Convergence. We're taking sensors and shooters and using artificial intelligence and an integrated battle command system to tie that together. So we're getting lethal effects in tens of seconds by tens of minutes. And that's how we believe we get the overmatch within the joint force, working with our joint partners that we're going to need to deter, whether that's in the Pacific or whether that's in Europe. And if you take a look at the systems that we're developing, that's why it's long-range precision fires, because quite frankly, we got long ranges we're going to have to deal with. That's why Future Vertical Lift has a speed and range component to it that we haven't had before. That's why air and missile defense is tied into an integrated brigade system. That's why our soldiers are going to be extremely lethal, and we've got to give them the best technology because we could be outnumbered. So that's where all this comes together in the organizations that we're building, the tactics that or doctrine that we're developing, and the weapon systems that we're fielding.
Thank you, General. And Secretary, I just kind of touched on what you probably saw the numbers that Germany came up with on their defense commitment. How do you feel about that? What's the administration's position?
So I'll let the administration speak firsthand, sir. What I would say is, we're committed to meeting the requirements that we have against our O plans, against the plans that we have in Europe, against the plans that we have in Pacific. From the Army's perspective, looking very parochially and inwardly at the Army, our concern is, can we meet those requirements, and do we have the consistent, stable funding we need to meet those requirements?
The only reason I make that point, it's disappointing in the sense that we're counting on our allies, especially in Europe, to pick up the slack with a potential adversary who we all know who it is, Russia, and for us to obviously move into Asia and with limited resources. So I hope the pressure continues on these countries in Europe to meet their obligations to NATO. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Capter and then Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I didn't realize we'd have a second round. I'll go back to my interest in Russia and particularly, General, your statement, Russia increases its disruptive behavior. Could you talk a little more in detail about disruptive behavior and what evidence you've seen of that, as well as your colleagues that you speak with at the department?
Well, when I take a look at, the potential competitors out there, and I call them competitors, they're not necessarily adversaries, but they're certainly competitors. And the pacing threat right now is China, but we are also concerned about Russia, because Russia has a very significant amount of nuclear weapons. And we just we're watching right now activities in around Ukraine, and they do have a capable military, but they're also involved in a lot of other areas around the world. They have a cyber capability. They have
General, could I interrupt you there and just ask, in terms of their cyber capability, what evidence do you see them using that in various ways inside our country?
Well, I would think I'd defer to probably best to have General Nakasone actually go into a classified briefing and lay that out, or at least they have described that type of capability. I'm more in the general. I know they have a cyber capability, but I'm not really prepared to go into that level of detail.
All right. What about their broadcasts on Sputnik and so forth, TV, in every cab in New York and hotel rooms and all? Is that something that Army follows?
Well, we don't necessarily follow it, but what we're very concerned about, we talk about all domain operations, and the one domain, we talk about air, land, sea, cyber, and space, but there's certainly another spare, if you will, or it's not necessarily a domain, but an area that we're concerned about, and that is information. And, the power of social media, the power of to put information out there that may not be correct, to me is extremely concerning. In some ways, it can be very dangerous because you can put information out there that is misinformation, which is very different than the rules we operate under. And countries like that can put disinformation out there and in some ways, impact the people that are watching what's going on.
Isn't Vladimir Putin a pretty good inventor of programming where falsehoods are common?
Well, I don't think I'm not going to comment on what he does or doesn't do. I don't think it would be appropriate for me.
Ms. Kaiser, you brought up a really good point. We are having a classified briefing. We'll make sure that your staff gets that on your calendar for in 2 weeks on the cyber. You raise an extraordinarily important discussion that we need to have.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Do you still want to submit more things on Russia for the record?
I will.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
We'll look forward to that. Mr. Carter and then Mr. Diaz-Balart.
General McConnell.
Mr. Carter, I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Try that. Okay, now you can see me. Can you hear me? You can't hear
there
me?
you go. You popped up. You moved. I can see you. You're right next to me. Your questions, please.
I try to keep moving all the time. General McConnell, we got to go to the fight. Wherever we go in the world, especially in this near-peer fight that could be coming our way, the Chinese know we have to travel long distances to put our army in play. And from what I've been able to understand and the limited reading that I've been able to do, they are working on systems to prevent us to quickly get to the fight, because they know that's one of our real assets, and to try to interfere with our battlefield communication capability. What is as you look at the Army plans, right now we're on the ground in Korea. It's probably, if it gets hot, it's going to get hot in China. And we got to go to the fight. Are you all looking at that and what they are doing to counter getting our soldiers there?
Yes, comrades. We have a concept that we call calibrated force posture, and it's really a term of exactly what you're discussing. Is we have forces that are forward, and in some cases we need to get more there. We have forces that are rotating into various countries in the region. We use a concept called dynamic force employment to quickly move forces into that area. And we're working very closely with allies and partners. So we're tied into them. We're interoperability with them. We've worked with them with our security force assistance brigades to increase their capacities and capabilities of those partners that we have shared interests. But we are certainly concerned about those potential threats, and we are working together as a joint team to overcome them.
On the issue of our strong near partners, that would be basically Japan and probably Australia. I know Japan's got a very, very solid Navy. What kind of ground force capability do they offer? And then what about the Australians?
Well, we have very good partners. You mentioned Japan. You met the Australians and other partners we train with very closely. But to me, it becomes a whole of military effort. And I think what's very, very valuable is when most of the countries in the region share the same values. They want a free and open Indo-Pacific, and they come together. And we've seen some countries actually speaking out on this, which is very bold, that they're coming out and saying this is the type of situation that we want. And what we're doing is working very closely with them from the Army and the rest of the services to make sure that we're aligned and we can help them achieve their objectives.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz. Thank you, Mr. Diaz-Balart, and then Mr. Cole, if he's still available.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. We talked about, and obviously it makes sense to me that, you know, we have to always be very, very aware of extremism, whether it's racism, white nationalism. But in another hearing, the ranking member asked the question as to what is the definition of extremism. And so, for example, I would argue that, you know, fascism is extremism. I would argue that Marxism or communism or socialism is extremism. So what's the definition of extremism? And when you look at extremism and rooting out extremism and make sure that that doesn't take root in the Army, is it just you know, one of those issues, or do you look at you know, trained Marxists? Do you look at you know, fascist? Do you look at you know, socialist? White? What is the definition of extremism? And I don't expect, gentlemen, an answer right now, but I think it would be helpful for us to understand what the definition of extremism is, and does it include things like, you know, Marxism or socialism or communism or fascism or other type of extremist policies? You know, what is that definition? So if I could just put that out there.
I'd be happy to give some thoughts if helpful now, sir. Yeah, your call.
Great. Sure. Absolutely.
I mean, I've tried to emphasize significantly, you know, the chief and I have done a lot of work and had a lot of conversations with the force on this. And I've tried to emphasize that, number one, it's not about a soldier's political, social, or religious views. I've really focused on two things in my conversations with soldiers. Number one is advocating violence or participating in violence. So you can have a range of views. That is okay. But when you begin to advocate violence to advance those views, you've crossed the line and you're no longer consistent with the Army values. You're no longer a law-abiding citizen. You're now undermining the rule of law. The second thing that I've focused on is activities or actions that a soldier could take in a unit setting that might disrupt the cohesion of that unit. And that would be something like discriminatory or racist behavior in a unit. You know, if we ask our soldiers to go to war, we owe them that they know that the soldier to the left and to the right of them has their back. And so if you have a soldier that is engaged in any type of racist or discriminatory conduct with a fellow soldier, that calls into question that soldier knows somebody else doesn't have their back. So I focused on those two things: anything that disrupts unit cohesion, that disrupts readiness, and the second is anything that crosses the line and says, I'm going to advocate violence or participate in violence to advance a view which otherwise might be protected by the First Amendment.
No, that makes sense. But then I guess theoretically, then you could be a white extremist or a Marxist or whatever, and not advocate violence, and that would still be fine, I guess.
Well, there's a definition that is being worked out, that's being refined, and we can get that over to you, Congressman. Those are the two things that I've focused on.
I mean, in other words, I get the issue of violence. That makes sense to me. But if we're going to be then rooting out extremism as far as ideology, for example, if you're a white nationalist or a fascist, Nazi, neo-Nazi, or a communist or a socialist, or that's when it gets a little bit more interesting. And so those are the definitions that I think I would like to get a clarification as to, is how do you deal with those if they're not advocating for violence? Is it all right to be a white nationalist or a neo-Nazi or a communist or a Marxist or a socialist if you're not advocating for violence? So those are issues that I know are more difficult, and that's why I think it would be interesting to get a definition of how you all are going to be doing that in the future. And so I would greatly appreciate that. Now, as far as modernization, and again, we don't have the president.
I'll give you another.
Madam Chairwoman.
I'm going to give you another 30 seconds.
Well, Madam Chairwoman, again, you're very kind. I do not want to abuse your kindness. Never abuse the Chairwoman's kindness. So thank you so very much. But I yield back. I did not realize that my time had ended. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Diaz-Balart has brought this definition issue up on several of our hearings. It's something that committee is very interested in. It needs to be across all the services. It needs to be across the government, including other federal agencies and that's important. And as we, in the Scandinavian countries come to mind, I think we need to be mindful of some of our allies who are democracies, but also practice democracy a little different than we do in some regards. I have a couple of things I want to follow up with you gentlemen. The committee is going to be asking you a couple of questions on Army modernization that weren't touched on. For example, one of the questions will be something similar to, in the next 3 to 5 years, when a large portion of these programs move from R&D to procurement, do you have the resources to do these production contracts? So, I mean, as we move forward, that has to be planned into the budget, but still keep the modernization moving forward. So we want to understand your thoughts on how you're going to balance that. And then something that's come up that Mr. Calvert's brought up before, and I have too in other hearings, is, what kind of reaction are you receiving from industry? And is your strategy really a strategy that embraces and supports small business industrial partners into the future? Where I'm going to have some questions. We're going to have a hearing on healthcare, and this will just kind of maybe help prep you for that. Having to do with the health defense agencies, OSD Health Affairs, and the interpretation of the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, and how some of those are being interpreted very broadly. We also have concerns about the health, the Defense Health Agency's implementation of some of the medical reforms and how that they fit into reauthorization. We don't want to be funding things that conflict with what is authorized. And then, as Congress moves forward with the congressionally directed medical research programs, they fund high-risk, high-level reward research, and it impacts our warfighters, DoD beneficiaries, but also have great impact on the population for healthcare here in the United States. So we're going to have some questions on that. And a question we've been submitting to everyone has been focusing on coronavirus, but that has changed a little bit how we talk about COVID now that we're going more to shots in arms. We still need to do testing. What are you going to need to have shots in arms to be able to conduct and to move forward safely, and how, if there are things we can do to help you with implementation of that. So this has been a very fruitful discussion. I want to thank all the committee members. Mr. Calvert and I are so proud of the engagement that everybody has in here. We both want to thank you, as well as the community, for your service. For those who serve, alongside of you, for your families who serve with you. Know that this committee wishes the servicemen and women good health during this time of COVID, safe missions in which people return safely to their homes. Your service is very, very much appreciated. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.